So as the title suggests, I decided to approach the whole idea of bridging the gap that exists between theory and practice using the idea of social labs and how it can be utilized in teaching urban informality and development. So moving on to my next slide. Basically, I'm just explaining about using social labs as a tool for teaching. And of course, in my own experience, from my own Kenyan experience, I find that there's a lot of opposition to really teaching international development studies. And of course, you have issues of collapsing the course and its material into other areas. This has happened in the University of Nairobi. There was an attempt to do that. It has succeeded in my own university. So of course, there's a lot of skepticism. The idea that it sounds quite colonial in its leanings, in its foundation. So this is what sometimes makes it difficult in my perspective, in my space to teach development studies. So moving on to the next slide, I find that there's the whole issue of representation. What kind of material exists? Like yesterday, I was looking at something, some material, and there was the whole issue of access to data, access to materials for teaching in development in developing countries. What kind of books do you have? What kind of journal articles? Is there access to some of those top journals? So that kind of now makes it hard for our students to really internalize the whole idea of international development studies. The material is missing, the links are missing. How do we make it easy for students to understand that there are actually links between what we theorize in class, those models, the concepts that we explain, and actual working ideas that they can access. So moving on to the next slide, I'm looking at the use of social labs. So social labs was something I stumbled on in some fieldwork that we carried out in 2018 in Ghana, some program that we had there. And for me, it struck a chord with me because we are looking at international development studies and the concepts that it has in a real life experience. So it was social, it is experimental. We are actually carrying out a kind of small social experiment out in the field, and we are going through a systematic process which addresses some of the skepticism that we see arising from so many people concerning development studies. So here we are in the field, we are using experiential learning, we are explaining this process that now is able to help us to bridge that gap. The student now is able to move from that concept in the class. Now we are in the field, they're able to connect the two. It begins to make sense. You're able to flesh out that idea. So moving on to the next slide, please. My next slide, of course, everything here now, we are talking about theory. So as we speak about theory, I'm looking at issues of social capital, how it draws on the strength of various partners. We're looking at power. Again, power arises where there is maybe a disconnect, a relationship that is asymmetrical. There's one person probably has more power than the other, but of course, all these people we are looking at are key stakeholders in the whole issue of social labs and how we are using it as a tool for teaching international development studies. So moving on to my next slide, please. So here I'm talking about the use of that cycle, which we can use to explain to students. I'm talking about urban social sustainability in marginalized communities. You have various stakeholders, you bring them together. And in that process, as I've used in my fieldwork in around 2019, so we have all these stakeholders together. And then moving on to the next slide, yeah, we first begin by the first phase. We talk about what we know about social sustainability, what problems the informal settlement could have. And then we decide as a team together, what are we working on? It could be issues around water, around sanitation, around mapping also. How do we go about it? And then we come up with a social intervention. It could be counter mapping. It could be, which is like developing our own maps of the area. It could be figuring out where we would like, where the community would like to have water points. So issues like that. And then we go out and try and implement some of those ideas in the area on an experimental basis, of course. And then our last phase in this process now, as a team together with the students, we gather feedback so that we improve the process and how we tackle the issues that have arisen. Maybe there's someone else selling the same product, whether it is water, there's another tanker there. Where is it too far to the health center? Does that mean there's a problem with the non-formal school? You know, issues that actually make sense to the key stakeholder in this process if we were working in an informal settlement as it is in my example. So moving on to the next slide, please. I give there an example of a special planning area in one of the informal settlements in Nairobi, which is our capital city. This one was a process of agreement between the key stakeholders, the informal settlement community and the government, just as a way of designing interventions in the informal settlement through a process of consensus. Of course, this arose from a process of a kind of a social lab, because it brought together all those players together with other universities. And now this developed a document. Of course, this document now drives the whole process of the kind of developmental interventions we would like to see in the slum. Of course, this is because you can't really do away with the whole settlement. It's here to stay, but how do we improve people's lives where they are? It should be through this process something that is meaningful to the actual person gaining from that process. Moving on to my next slide, please. Thank you. So social labs provide an opportunity for teaching international development studies because they challenge notions of Western-oriented development models, because here you're going back to what people actually know at the grassroots. They're using their own knowledge. We're also applying co-production processes, co-production where us as universities and the local communities and other stakeholders, we use those processes in the field and then now also in class to embed international development studies as a field of practice in the global South, so that we find its significance. Yeah, how significant is it to people? And also it is a way of enabling the developmental state. Yeah, so this is the state that takes into account the needs of the people at the grassroots. Of course, we are looking at the whole issue of politics. Politics is hard to, we cannot really take politics away from the whole process of development. So in engaging with politics, then it is the kind of politics that brings international development studies into the process of policy making. What does it offer? And then we look at the interdisciplinarity of knowledge that it has as an opportunity that makes it easier to tackle some of those complex global issues, whether it's at the local level, at the regional level, at the global level. And then my next slide, please. Thank you. So, of course, challenges still arise. The kind of material that we use, it would be interesting to have, of course, I know some of it already exists, but authoring educational material that is reflective of scholars from the Global South should be something that we should be looking at, and also an increased funding for local scholars to be able to go out into the field, to find that link between what is actually happening on the ground and then theorizing in a way that makes it easy to integrate knowledge on IDS and then improve or like give it greater prominence as a field of study in the Global South. So finally,
just have 3 more minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, looking at my last slide, I just have some references there, and I think I'm done. Thank you so much. I await your questions. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. What questions do people have? And feel free to either use the chat or just take yourself off mute and ask.
I was going to ask a question. Can I go ahead, or is it?
Go ahead, yeah.
And that was a great presentation. Wow, I really enjoyed hearing. Would you mind just expanding a little bit more on some of the internal challenges you have in creating these social labs? Because really fascinating bringing together a variety of different groups that I imagine have really divergent interests. It might be really, if you don't mind, I know it's a little bit off topic, but just discussing social labs internally, some of the challenges you have in bringing them together into one room and then engaging in the various topic discussions. If that's okay, I'm not sure if it's way off topic, but I just really
okay.
You had a,
all right. Thank you. Okay, can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay, so if we use the example of the special planning area, that means you have various stakeholders, whether they are national or international non-governmental organizations. You have academic institutions, and you also have the local community. You have issues of power, the asymmetry of power, because the government is also taking part in it. You have also power players in the informal settlement community, people who have different ideas on how the whole process of designing this document for change should be done. So, of course, as you've mentioned, they have divergent views, and trying to come to a point of understanding that this is also an issue of human dignity. You can't really call for complete and mass destruction of the informal settlement. You have to find ways of managing people's expectations. If it's in situ development on the ground, and also what the government wants to see, whether it's infrastructure, roads, hospitals, and things like that, all those things have to be taken into account. That's why it took more than 1 year for this process to take place and to come up with such a document. I hope I've answered your question.
Hello. Hi, Ruth. I'm also located in Kenya, and I just am curious. It looks like from the map that that settlement was likely displaced as a result of the new viaduct highway. Was that the kind of like prior work that you were doing to kind of prepare for that? And I think it's recently opened, right?
No, what happened?
That particular community, was that as a result of kind of planning for the new airport highway into town?
Oh, you're saying that it was completely demolished?
Well, I'm just curious if that was
No,
like
no.
kind of the work leading into building and opening that interstate.
Okay, so right, so the way you put it, what actually happened, see, that's another problem of some of these processes that we use in the field. It made it easier for the government to access the area. So of course now the road, it was easier to demolish some of those homes, even with the coronavirus, right? You saw people sleeping outside. A lot of that, people were displaced, schools, hospitals, market stalls, people lost their homes. So it's not like the whole slum was demolished, but a lot of people lost their homes. And also now, right now, I don't know if you've seen the whole debate on some of them actually going back to where they used to live, but the road is already there. So how do you get people to go back to live in a place where there's already a road? Okay, so I don't know if I've answered your question, because Mukuru still exists, but it might not be as large as it used to be. And also we have the issue of, I don't know if you've seen the company that's now claiming some of the land as its own, claiming that it has a title deed. So in using some of the ideas for teaching out in the field, it might expose some of these vulnerable communities to some of those political processes. So it's kind of a disadvantage or a challenge that comes up in the whole idea. Yeah. I hope I've answered your question.
Ruth, we have some questions in the chat. Would you like me to
Okay.
read them to you, or can you see them?
Yes, I can see them. Let me begin with the first one. I think prior informed consent, a lot of these processes were driven by local non-governmental organizations. We have one called Muungano wa Wanavijiji, so it is affiliated to the Slum Dwellers International. So they have a lot of mobilization that they did on the ground to bring various stakeholders, those stakeholders all together. And it's quite an intensive and emotive process, because all those stakeholders have their own expectations. And of course, some will be met and some will still be unmet. It's kind of a tricky process.
Ruth, I'm going to interrupt right now. I just put that last question from Nathan in that record and reflect document. And if you could answer it there, that would be great, because I want to keep us on time and move on to our next session.